A very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for finding time to be with me this afternoon. It's just a minute past 3 p.m. here in Nairobi, East African time. I trust that your day is going on well. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are tuned in and joining me from today, being the 21st of November 2022. My name is Miriam Ogutu. And as usual, it is nice to have you on the show. So there's this country I love talking about so much, and it fascinates me, and not in a good way, of the many things that news that come from this country. And of course, this country is Equatorial Guinea, and we know they went for the elections yesterday to elect their new leader. And guess who the new leader of Equatorial Guinea is? Yes, the current president, who has already served for 43 years. Apparently, the preliminary election results released by Equatorial Guinea's government today show the ruling party is winning over 99%. Yes, so, President Nguema will be extending his rule. He's been there for 43 years, so he has another 7 years to go. Equatorial Guinea's one term is about 7 years, so there you go. So that is what we are going to talk about today. And I know a lot of countries in the continent are plagued with corruption, bad governance, bad records on human rights, but when you look at Equatorial Guinea, for me, it is just on the top of that. It is the top tier of a very good example of what a country can be when we lack good leadership, when we lack good governance, when we lack transparent institutions and strong institutions in a country. And that's where leaders like Nguema can thrive, because they get to lead a country as though they are leading their own personal enterprise, as we shall get to see as we continue with the show. And early partial results show that Obiang's ruling Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea and coalition won about 67,1212 votes out of the 67,196 counted so far this year election. There were around 400,000 registered voters, and so that is what is happening right now. But as I've said, of course, the ruling party has been placed to be leading in the results that have been received so far, with it accounting for the 99% of the votes that have been counted so far. Interesting kind of democracy there. So, in case you don't know much about this Equatorial Guinea, other than having the longest serving head of state, I think, in the world, but also in Africa, the president has served for 43 years, plus this other 7 that is going to get, so his reign will continue. The population in Guinea so far is about 1,468,777. That is according as per 2021 a census there. And now the national language, of course, is Spanish, French, and Portuguese. If I had enough time, I would have explained why this is so, but I shall not be looking at that today. So that is their official languages: Spanish, French, and Portuguese. It is a former colony of Spain, and it received its independence in 1968. Their currency is Central African franc, as of the many countries that were former colonies of French. They are all tied to the franc. And the country's motto is unity, peace, and justice. The president, who has reigned for 43 years and now has added another term, is President Teodoro Obiang Basongo, and it is located in west coast of Central Africa. And it is one of the tiniest countries we have in this continent, with just approximately 28,000 square kilometers. All right. So that is just a quick country profile of Equatorial Guinea. Now, after becoming independent from Spain in 1968, Equatorial Guinea was ruled by President for life, Francisco Macias Nguema, until he was overthrown in a coup in 1979 by his nephew, now the current president, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasongo, who has served as the country's president since. So before the current president was in power, his uncle is the one who took over after Equatorial Guinea got its independence. And since then, his leadership was just as bad, as we shall see in the next few minutes. And then he was overthrown from power in 1979. So he took over from, Spain in 1968. Both presidents. So Equatorial Guinea has only had two presidents. First, Macias Nguema, who was overthrown by his nephew, the current president. So they've only known two presidents from one family. Now, both presidents have been widely characterized as dictators by foreign observers. Since the mid-1990s, Equatorial Guinea has become one of Sub-Saharan Africa's largest oil producers. It has subsequently become the richest country per capita in Africa, and its gross domestic product adjusted for purchasing power parity, that is the PPP per capita, ranks at 43rd in the world. However, the wealth is distributed extremely unevenly, with few people benefiting from the oil riches, and the country ranks 144th on the 2019 Human Development Index, with less than half the population having access to clean drinking water, and 7.9% of children dying before the age of 5, of course, from malnutrition and other treatable illnesses and other preventable ways, that we've seen. So let's just pause there for a moment. Now, this country has been ranked as one of the richest countries per capita in Africa. In fact, when you look at the wealth that is in Equatorial Guinea, it should be ranking at the levels of Kuwait. We know Kuwait is a very small country in the Middle East, but it has a lot of oil, same as what we see in Equatorial Guinea. But in Kuwait, they know how to manage their wealth, and so the wealth there is fairly distributed, and so everybody gets to benefit from the share of this natural resource. But that is not the case in Equatorial Guinea. So as much as it ranks 43rd in the world as far as one of the richest countries, per capita, especially here in Africa, and it has the poorest population again here in Africa. So you can imagine the disconnect, the disparity that is quite wide, and that is because of certain factors that I've mentioned there as we were starting: poor governance, of course, a lot of corruption, and a country that is being run as a personal enterprise by the president, the first president, and now his nephew. As a former Spanish colony, the country maintains Spanish as its official language alongside French and recently Portuguese, like when I was, you saw that country profile, being the only African country aside from the largely unrecognized Zawahiri Arab Democratic Republic where Spanish is an official language. Okay, fun fact. Now, it is also the most widely spoken language, considerably more than the other two official languages, according to the institution. Cervantes, which puts it at 87.7% of the population has a good command of Spanish as their first language. Equatorial Guinea's government is authoritarian, as you would have imagined. Otherwise, why would the president have been in power for 43 years? And now they've just come out of a very symbolic, I think that was just a formality to endorse again another 7 years for Teodoro. So it is expected that it is under such a rule that one president can rule for that many years, and has consistently ranked among the worst of the worst worst in freedom and houses annual survey of political civil rights. Reporters Without Borders ranks President Obiang among its predators of the press. Freedom and human trafficking is a significant problem, with the U.S. Trafficking in Persons report identifying Equatorial Guinea as a source and a destination country for forced labor and sex trafficking. Now, the report also noted that Equatorial Guinea does not fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking, but is making significant efforts to do so. So, away from that, I mentioned that Francisco Macias Nguema was the first president. So let's just get a bit of a background that will enable us now to transit to see how did Equatorial Guinea end up with the president it has today. So Francisco Macias Nguema, that was the first president, and he was he was disposed in 1979, and he mostly is referred to as Macias. And he was an Guinean politician who served as the first president of Equatorial Guinea, from the country's independence in 1968 until his overthrow in 1979. He is widely remembered as one of the most brutal dictators in history. Now, according to people who understand, and from the news reports that we've been receiving from Equatorial Guinea, which, by the way, is very limited because press freedom there is almost non-existent. The press is highly controlled by the state. But it shows that the current leadership is worse than the first presidency after independence. And so Equatorial Guineans have not known any better. I think they've had a raw deal as far as leadership, in this continent is concerned. And a member of the Fang people, this was the first president. Macias held numerous official positions under Spanish colonial rule before being elected the first president and soon to be independent country in 1968. Early in his rule, he consolidated power by establishing an extreme cult of personality, a one-party state ruled by his United Nations National Workers' Party, and declaring himself president for life in 1972. Okay. President for life. Okay, whether you like it or not, I'm here, I'm God sent, okay? Which was then ratified by referendum the following year. So he had made a decree. This was not just a roadside thing. He had made a decree, and that was a constitution by itself. I guess it was a constitution by himself. So he made that decree that he was a president for life, but that was later ratified by referendum the following year. In 1973, he had made that declaration in 1972. Due to his dictatorship, severe human rights abuse and economic mismanagement, tens of thousands of people fled the country to avoid persecution, while Equatorial Guinea was internationally nicknamed the Dachau of Africa. His rule also led to significant brain drain, as intellectuals and educated classes were particular targets for his persecution. In 1979, he was overthrown in a coup d'etat by his nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, and was subsequently tried and executed. So he was tried and he was killed by his own nephew, okay? Depending on the source and during his government, people are said to have died anywhere between 50,000 to 80,000, or even 300,000 to 400,000 people living in the country were killed at that time. He was compared to Pol Pot because of the violent and unpredictable and anti-intellectual nature of his government. So, in other words, if you were an intellectual and you'd gone to school and you thought that your knowledge was needed in Equatorial Guinea, that you were wrong, because you will be state enemy number one. He did not like anyone intellectual. I guess he had his own insecurities, and I think to some extent he was thought to be borderline mental ill or something like that. And so he was compared to Pol Pot. Now, Pol Pot was a Cambodian, revolutionary dictator. I think Cambodian, if you know a bit of your history. He was a politician who ruled Cambodia as a prime minister of the Democratic Kampuchea between 1976 and 1979, and ideologically he was a Marxist and a Leninist and a Khmer nationalist, and he was a leader member of Cambodia's communist movement and the Khmer Rouge from 1963 until 1997, and served as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Kampuchea from 1963 to 1981. And under his administration, the reason why now Teodoro, no, the first president of Equatorial Guinea, Messias Nguema, was being compared to Pol Pot, this Cambodian revolutionary dictator, is because under his administration, Cambodia was converted into a one-party communist state and perpetrated the Cambodian genocide. Go check your history. I will not get into that today because that is not a point of a talk, but I just needed to make that reference so that we understand why historians or people or, they could compare his behavior and his leadership as that of Pol Pot. So I digress from that. So because of these many things that he was doing that was just completely out of order, medical reports from his early career suggested that Messias Nguema was mentally unstable. I mean, what else? What can explain the killing of that many people? Because a normal person would stop and think. And so there were reports that suggested he was mentally unstable. And based on a report from 1968, the service do documentation, a very a long Spanish word there that I can't read because I know I'll not say it correctly, so I'll just leave that alone, argued that he suffered from mental disorders and venereal diseases whose effects of his psyche were worsened by his regular consumption of drugs such as cannabis. He loved bang so much, and iboga, which is a drink with strong hallucinogenic effects. So he loved being high. I think that is when he had Mary killing people when he was high, and he loved cannabis so much, marijuana. And several contemporaries, such as the French ambassador to Equatorial Guinea, argued that Messias Nguema was insane. I think he had smoked too much of that, so he was always on cloud nine. I don't know what that means, but I hear that's what happens when you take too much of that stuff. Now, some observers have posited that Messias Nguema psychological trauma and that his behavior could have been affected by other possible mental illness, as well as his reported periodic use of drugs. And there, so like a journalist like Paul Kenyon described Messias Nguema as dangerously mentally ill. I guess he had a chance to acquaint himself with him. So that was the first leader, that was the first president who took over after Equatorial Guinea got its independence in 1968. And that very short history, you can already see what kind of path Equatorial Guinea was set up. And to make matters worse, he was removed in a coup d'etat by his nephew, who now you're going to look at, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasongo, and he is an Equatorial Guinean, a politician and former military officer who has served as the second president of Equatorial Guinea since August 1979. He is the longest serving president of any country ever, and the second longest consecutively serving current and royal national leader in the world. Okay? Apart from the monarchs, he's the longest serving head of state. After graduating from military school, Obiang held numerous positions under the presidency of his uncle, who he deposed, Francisco Messias Nguema, including director of the notorious Black Beach Prison. He ousted Messias in 1979, as I have explained there, in a military coup, and took control of the country as president and chairman of the Supreme Military Council junta. After the country's nominal return to civilian rule in 1982, he founded the Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea. PDGE in 1987, which was the country's sole legal party until 1992. He has overseen Equatorial Guinea's emergence as an important oil producer. Beginning in the 1990s, Obiang was the chairperson of the African Union from 2011 and 2012. So after Equatorial Guinea discovered they had oil at the beginning of 1990s, many thought that the fortunes of that country might change, and because when you look at the general, the national index as far as the GDP is concerned, it appears to show that there's some growth as far as the economy is concerned, and this was brought about by the discovery of the oil in the 1990s. But as I have explained at the beginning of this conversation, is that the way in which wealth is distributed in Equatorial Guinea is not even at all. Only the few at the top are the one who get to enjoy this wealth. And so as far as it's one of could be possibly the richest countries in Africa, it also has the poorest population, not just in Africa but on earth. Can you imagine that? Okay, so Obiang heads an authoritarian regime in Equatorial Guinea. I have explained that, and I think we all know that by now. He has been widely accused of corruption and abuse of power. Under his rule, Equatorial Guinea continues to have one of the worst human rights records in the world. It marked contrast to the trend towards democracy in most African countries. Equatorial Guinea is currently dominated by one party. It is a dominant one-party state in which Obiang's PDGE holds virtually all governing power in the nation and almost all seats in the legislature. The constitution provides Obiang sweeping powers, including the right to rule by decree, effectively making his government a legal dictatorship. Yeah. Obiang has placed family members in key government positions. Like I was watching another, piece just a couple of years ago where his cousin was the ambassador to the US a couple of years back, and another cousin was ambassador to I don't know which country. Of course, his son, his beloved firstborn son, is the vice president of this wonderful country. So, I mean, if nepotism was a person, he will be a perfect fit for that. Anyway, the country nominally returned to a civilian rule in 1982 with the enactment of a slightly less authoritarian constitution. At the same time, Obiang was elected to a 7-year term as a president. He was the only candidate in 1982. He was the only candidate in that election. So he was re-elected in 1989, again as the only candidate, all right? That is some interesting democracy right there. After other parties were nominally allowed to organize in 1992, he was re-elected again in 1996 and in 2002 with 98% of the votes in elections condemned as fraudulent by international observers. In 2002, for instance, at least one voting district was recorded as giving Obiang 103% of the vote. That means if, say, 1,000 people are registered to vote in this district, and then the votes that came in, forget that the number of registered voters, the official registered voters, say it was 1,000. The number came with over 1,000 votes having cast for Obiang. So it's fraudulent. And he was re-elected for a 4th term in 2009 with 97% of the vote, again amid accusations of voter fraud and intimidation, beating opposition leader Placido Michael Abogo. And now he was re-elected for a 4th term in 2009. With 97% of the vote. As I have said there, Obiang's rule was at first considered more humane than what his uncle was known to have been. And by some accounts, however, it has become increasingly brutal and has sagged the larger trend towards greater democracy in Africa. And according to most domestic and international observers, he leads one of the most corrupt, ethnocentric, and repressive regimes in the world. Equatorial Guinea is essentially a one-party state dominated by Obiang's Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea. And the constitution grants Obiang, as I said there, a lot of sweeping powers, which he really can lead by a decree. And although opposition parties were legalized in 1992, the legislature remains dominated by PDGE, and there is no substantive opposition to execute decisions in that country, or anybody who can dare to challenge Obiang's rule, because he has a certain jail. Remember at the start of this conversation, I mentioned how he was working for his uncle and he headed another, I think, main jail there. So that is where opposition, anyone who attempts any kind of dissent against the government, that's where you find yourself. So even the opposition there cannot really play their rightful place as the opposition and criticize the government, or even attempt. So a lot of them will flee the country, and I've seen a lot of them are in Spain and other countries, and they get to speak from outside of Equatorial Guinea, because you can't do that in inside Equatorial Guinea. Otherwise, you'll find yourself swimming, not with the fishes, but with the crocodiles. There's sort of a swamp or a lake near that that jail. I'm laughing, but it's not funny, where some opponents are not have disappeared too. I know, scary. Now, the opposition is barely tolerated. Indeed, in 2006, in 6 article in Diaspora quoted Obiang as asking, what right does the opposition have to criticize the actions of a government? This is what the President Obiang, was quoted as saying. What right does the opposition have to criticize the actions of a government? The opposition is severely hampered by the lack of a free press as a vehicle for their views. There are no newspapers, and all broadcast media are either owned outright by the government or controlled by its allies. A banana republic, I think, when you don't have all these checks and balances, and you don't have all these safeguards for democracy, for some very important freedoms, then what do you have? You have no rights at all. So it's interesting. So as I've mentioned there, the country does very well. In fact, after discovering oil in the early 1990s, the GDP of that country has improved, but only a few people are able to celebrate and enjoy this wealth. Forbes magazine has said that Obiang has a net worth of, they place him at $600 million US, and is one of the world's wealthiest heads of state. Okay, and his people are among the poorest, not just in Africa, but in the world. Okay, and I was just watching a short documentary that was done, and you could see a huge part of the country does not have electricity or running water. And if you look at the amount of wealth that Equatorial Guinea is able to make from oil alone, then it should be one of the countries whose people, since look at the population, about 1.4, close to 1.5 million people only. So it can actually transform the lives of every individual in that country if this wealth was managed properly. It could be the Kuwait of Africa, but unfortunately, the country does not even have running waters. And from the documentary I was watching, the country, I think, has about maybe 2 swimming pools in the whole country, and slums all over the place. And the children have to study along a road that leads to the presidential residence, I think the State House, because that is where the lighting is. So there are street lights at night, and because they don't have electricity in their homes, and maybe they can't afford kerosene or any other means of lighting or energy, so they get to do their homework under the street lights leading to State House, for those who are lucky that live near the State House. That is quite despicable. And to know that is one of the wealthiest presidents, heads of states around the world, it makes it even worse. Now, in 2003, Obiang told his citizenry that he felt compelled. Okay, it's like a calling from God himself. He felt compelled to take full control of the national treasury, so he took over the central bank of Equatorial Guinea. All right, so I think he was just having after perhaps a good lunch one Friday afternoon, and he decided, you know what? I feel I'm the only person who can properly take care of the wealth of this country. So what do I do? He felt compelled, to take over the national treasury in order, these were his words, to prevent civil servants from being tempted to engage in corrupt practices. Obiang, one of the most corrupt leaders in Africa, but he felt compelled so that, other civil servants in Equatorial Guinea don't get tempted to engage in corrupt practices. So now he has full control of the National Treasury and the Central Bank of Equatorial Guinea. See? Okay. Now, Obiang then deposited more than $500 million after he felt compelled. After he took over, he immediately, just after that, deposited $500 million into more than 60 accounts controlled by himself and his family at Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C. A leading U.S. federal court to fine the bank $16 million for allowing him to do so. So the bank had to pay for it, and I think it suffered mercifully. Obiang and his family opened over 60 bank accounts in the U.S. in the same bank. Like, don't you even stop and ask? Doesn't it even go against, financial rules, international? How does this even work? One family, one person opening over 60 accounts. Don't you stop and ask? You would think the U.S., where they keep throwing down our throats the things to do with, good governance and strong institutions. What happened, Riggs Bank, that you allowed one person to open over 60 bank accounts? That should have been a red flag. But I guess they knew the kind of person they were operating with, because even the ExxonMobil, that is one of the leading from the U.S., the oil company from U.S. is one of the leading explorers who are exploring the oil, in Equatorial Guinea. And the deal that they entered with this government is bogus, that only favors them. And I'm sure this was done because ExxonMobil is a huge company in the U.S., and we've seen it is also one of the companies that is busy in northern part of Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado, that region that has conflict. And so the country only gets 12% of the oil revenue. Exxon Mobil and another company, I can't remember from where, they get the huge chunk of this revenue being accrued. So Equatorial Guinea only gets 12% of this revenue, and it goes to very few pockets there. And so anyway, so I'm not surprised, so this Riggs Bank has since suffered so much because of this. And a United States Senate investigation in 2004 found that the Washington based Riggs Bank had taken $300 million in payments on behalf of Obiang from Exxon Mobil and Hess Corporation, like I've mentioned there. Now, in 2008, the country became a candidate for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, an international project meant to promote openness about government oil revenues, but never qualified and missed the April 2010 deadline. Okay, so it does not want any form of accountability. And beginning in 2007, Obiang and several other African state leaders came under investigation for corruption and fraudulent use of funds. He was suspected of using public funds to finance private mansions and other luxurious life for both himself and his family. Him and his son, in particular, owned several properties and supercars in France, and several complaints were also filed in the U.S. courts against Obiang's son. Attorneys stressed that the funds appropriated by Obiang's were taken quite legally under Equatorial Guinean laws, even though those laws might not agree with international standards. And like I've said, he makes laws by decree. So as long as it favors him, it does not matter what the international standards or laws say. So the U.S. Department of Justice alleged that Obiang and his son had appropriated hundreds of millions of dollars through corruption, and in 2011 and early 2012. Many assets were seized from Obiang and his son by the French and American governments. I think that made a lot of headlines, including mansions, wine collections, and supercars. The United States, France, and Spain have all investigated the Obiang family's use of public funds. And the corruption investigation is ongoing. And we've seen even recently, as recent as last year, I think French held an auction of his son's cars, I think, and some other luxurious items there. I think it was France, if I'm not wrong. And Obiang, his cabinet, and his family allegedly have received billions in undisclosed oil revenue each year from the nation's oil production. Marathon Oil purchased land from Abayak, Obiang's personal investment vehicle, for more than $2 million US. And in June 2004, the sale was pending, but Marathon had already made 611,000 first payment with a check made out to Obiang. Marathon also was involved in a joint venture to operate. So this is a company that I think is tied to the first family. So it goes and goes and goes. And because of the interest of time, Obiang had a close relationship with the Washington, D.C.-based Riggs Bank, as I have said. And he's said to have been welcomed by top Riggs officials. And, you know, when you see I was just watching some footage a while back. During those days, when he would visit the U.S. or other countries, as corrupt and as bad as his record is as far as human rights abuses, because these are the values that these Western countries keep penalizing a lot of leaders, especially in Africa, but not for Obiang. Obiang was they rolled some red carpet for him, and he was given, very preferential treatment in the U.S., in other countries across the world, and that is because of what these countries, I think, were getting from Equatorial Guinea. So on November 2010, the Supreme Court of France ruled that a complaint filed by Transparency International in France on the 2nd of December 2008 was admissible to the court system there. The decision allowed the appointment of an investigating judge and a judicial inquiry into claims that Obiang used state funds to purchase private property in France. A 2010 article published in Forbes magazine suggested, like I said earlier, that he is roughly he has gathered over $700 million US of the country's wealth, and this money, a lot of it is in the UN's bank accounts. And of course, Obiang favors his son, Teodoro Obiang. So it was thought that this boy, this young man, he is an Instagram socialite. That's what I call him. I'm sorry. But have you gone to his page on Instagram? You know, what he does is he's a socialite, and yet he's the vice president of Equatorial Guinea. So that is quite unfortunate. So I started by saying in this continent we do have a good amount of cases of bad governance, of human rights abuses, of corruption, of nepotism. But I think Equatorial Guinea just has taken that to the next level. So I started by saying the country went to its elections yesterday, and so far the reports that we are receiving is that the ruling party of Nguema so far has garnered about 99% of the votes that have been counted so far. More than 400 people registered to vote in the country, and of course he came to power in 1979, so he's been leading that country for 43 years, and now since obviously he will win these elections, that will add him another 7 years. So people had thought that he will retire. He's 80 years old. 80 years old. He's not done yet. So by the time they'll be going to another election, he will be 87, I suppose, if he'll still be alive then. So people had thought that he will give over the reins of power to his son, who is the vice president, Teodoro Obiang. who is embroidered in numerous corruption, scandals. So maybe that's why he did not want to give him that. So Equatorial Guinea's main opposition party says irregularities, this is the latest, took place in the country's general election on Sunday, in which the world's longest ruling leader, President Teodoro Obiang, sought to extend his 43 years rule. The Convergence of Social Democracy, CBDS, said it would not recognize the results of the fraudulent elections and that any person declared the president-elect will be considered illegitimate by the party. In a statement on Sunday, the party said that the vote was taking place amid flagrant and widespread irregularities across the country except in the capital, Malabo. The electoral authorities and the ruling party have not commented on the allegations. The CPDS said its agents saw voters being forced to elect candidates of the President's Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea. It also said the opposition was barred from monitoring the voting process, though through what it described as trickery. In a number of polling stations, election officials allowed people to vote on behalf of absent family members. Look at that. Okay, the party added. It denounced the confiscation of voter cards from voters who said were singled out as opposition supporters. CPDS's presidential candidate Andreas Esono Ondo also alleged fraud and irregularities across the country, including the public vote and shares of heads of polling stations voting on behalf of others. So if your person had died and they assumed there was a possibility he would have voted for the ruling party, they just stick there. All right. And if your person is sick in the hospital, they just assume this person, the intention was to vote for the ruling party. So they take on your behalf, whether you like it or not. Yeah. Or if your person had traveled for some family emergency somewhere and I don't know how they even determine who will show up. I guess they have the register, and towards the end of the voting hours they go through and they see who did not turn up to vote today. So are they alive? We are not sure, but I think they would have loved to vote for the ruling party and for their candidates in the different positions. This is ridiculous, and the fact that this continues to happen, and the fact that we don't query, and other countries don't query, and the African Union has not even raised issues as far as even the human rights abuses are concerned in Equatorial Guinea. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous, and hopefully one day, Equatorial Guineans will have a chance to really participate in a proper election, not this symbolic formality that was that happened yesterday, that has no basis. There's no democracy. The president is winning by 99%. That is something Trump would love so much, I think. Okay, but that is what Obiang is making. From what there were no observers there. The opposition parties were not allowed to have their own people to observe, except for a few places in the city. And even with that, they could see clearly some acute malpractices taking place as far as the elections were concerned. So what kind of democracy is this that we're having? I think Equatorial Guinea should officially declare that they have a monarchy, so that we know after this one is dead, because I think he means to stay there forever. So after he's gone, then his son, the Instagram socialite, who is the vice president, will take over, and then maybe after that, somebody else from the family, because he also took over from his uncle, from a coup. But as far as democracy and elections and these other things are concerned, I think that was sham. That was unnecessary. In fact, it was a waste of public resources. He would have just made a decree that, I'm continuing to be your president since I'm God sent. I'm continuing to be your president until I feel like I'm tired to do so. And then it appears nobody would have raised a finger, and then they would have continued instead of organizing an election, shambolic election, and perhaps those funds would have gone to benefit other areas, like put piped waters or electrify the villages or things like that, things that actually the people need there in Equatorial Guinea. But yet they have an election that is not really election by any standards, even the lowest in the world. But unfortunately, that is the story of Equatorial Guinea, and it is a reflection of many other stories from across the continent of Africa. So that is Teodoro Obiang, Africa's longest serving head of state, and he sought to extend his reign, and it appears that he will do so. And right now he has led for 43 years, and it's not yet enough, and he's 80 years old. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow, God willing. My name is Miriam Ogoto. This has been Diaspora Dispatches. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.